All right, hello again, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Kenneth Goodpaster's On Being Morally Considerable. So our central question for the class is, or one of our central questions is, who matters morally? So we know that people matter morally, but is it just people that matter morally, or do other things matter morally as well, like plants or animals or people from the future, right? If they do matter morally, then what is it that makes them matter morally? And so this is the central question that Goodpaster is going to try to answer for us. So he starts with a quote. From Aldo Leopold, who we will be looking at in just a few days. Um, and Leopold is one of the very first environmental philosophers, and he says that something is right when it preserves the integrity, sustainability, and beauty of the biotic community, and is wrong when it tends to do otherwise. So the criterion for right action, according to Leopold, is whether or not it maintains the biosphere, right? So um, this this in a lot of ways this influences Goodpaster's analysis of what gets to count as morally considerable. Okay, so um, consider this question. What, we may ask here, is the condition of moral relevance? What is the condition of having a claim to be considered by rational agents to whom moral principles apply, right? So the idea here is that if we're going to say that something matters morally, what does that thing have to have in order for us to care about it, or to bring it into our moral consideration, right? So so um, so if we wanted to say something like only humans matter, morally speaking, then we need to have some kind of non-arbitrary criterion that suggests why humans matter morally and not other things. Um, but the problem is that when we try to assign a feature that humans have, we're going to include other creatures as well. And so the central question here is, what is that feature that things have to have in order to be morally considerable? And so we can. So the question is, or like at least other versions of the question are like, who has moral standing, what has moral standing, what is the scope of the variable over which moral universalization ought to range, right? So think about Kant, right? When we universalize various principles, what is the domain of universalization? And then what is morally considerable, right? Okay. And so there are some problematic examples. For example, the environment, endangered species, animals, fetuses, like these things like appear to like matter morally, but like mainstream accounts of ethics tend to leave those things out. Okay, so here is what I take to be his thesis, and I'm just going to read it. Neither rationality nor the capacity to experience pleasure and pain seem to me necessary, even though they may be sufficient conditions on moral considerability. And only our hedonic and concentric forms of ethical reflection keep us from acknowledging this fact. Nothing short of the condition of being alive seems to me to be a plausible, non arbitrary criterion. Okay, so this is really interesting. The idea here is that, look, when we say that rationality is a necessary condition on moral considerability, when we say that the capacity to experience pain and pleasure as necessary conditions on moral considerability, when we say those things, look, it seems like these things are arbitrary, right? They don't appear to Goodpaster to be necessary conditions on moral considerability. So recall our first day of class when we talked about necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is a condition that a thing must have in order to get to a certain status, right? So if rationality is a necessary condition on moral considerability, that means that all non-rational things are not morally considerable, right? If we say that only sentient beings or beings that can feel pain and pleasure have moral considerability, then anything that's non-sentient is not going to have moral considerability. So even though those things might be sufficient for moral considerability, it's not the case that they're necessary. At least he's trying to claim here. So he wants to say that, look, the criterion for moral considerability is simply just being alive. Uh, that is what it takes to be morally considerable. That is, I think he wants to say, necessary and sufficient for being morally considerable. Okay, and so Goodpaster adds just after this, he's beginning to be persuaded that such implications may provide both a meaningful ethical vision and the hope of a more adequate action guide for the long-term future. So he thinks that if adopting this notion of moral considerability is going to have good long-term consequences. Okay, so. He makes four distinctions. And we haven't really talked a whole lot about this in this class, but philosophers are very, very interested in very fine-grained distinctions, right? So, what is the precise meaning of a given term? What is the precise meaning of of a concept? What is the precise meaning of, say, an interest, right? Philosophers want to be very, very precise when they're talking about these things and distinguish different concepts from other concepts. Okay, so Goodpaster, like any good philosopher, is making distinctions in this paper. So he wants to say that, look, his view is about moral considerability, not necessarily moral rights, right? Okay, so a thing can be morally considerable and have moral rights, like a human being, and or it can be the case that something is morally considerable and lacks moral rights. So the idea is that, look, if a thing is morally considerable, we have to have at least some reason to say destroy it. We have to have some good reason to use that thing as a means to an end. We have to have some reason to get rid of that thing, right? So, in any way to undermine that thing. Whereas a moral right might mean something like we owe certain things to that thing, right? It seems weird to say that like a plant has moral rights. We don't really owe anything to a plant, but in order to destroy a plant, we have to have some good reason to destroy the plant. That's what we might say. That's what we would say if um, we say that plants are morally considerable. And I mean, uh, eating is a good enough reason to kill a plant, right? So you can pick yourself an apple and eat the apple, even though you're destroying the apple. It's you have a good reason, namely to feed yourself, right? And so Goodpaster's not saying that we like can't kill anything that's alive ever, right? But the idea is that we can't kill something that's alive for no reason at all. Okay, and that is different from moral rights. Okay, and so we can distinguish between the criterion of moral considerability versus the criterion for moral significance. And this is we've kind of already talked about this a little bit in the last distinction, but the idea here is that look, okay, so two things can be morally considerable, and there can be like a hierarchy between those two things. Is the idea here. So if moral significance is like the most like matters morally the most, it would also be morally significant, but there, or it would also be morally considerable, and then there might be some morally considerable things that are not morally significant. So basically the idea here is that we can still put things on a hierarchy. Some things can matter more than others, right? So if in a circumstance when we had to choose the life of a human being versus the life of a plant, we can kill the plant, and that's like morally speaking okay. So his account is not making the claim that like plants and humans are equal in any way. Okay, so this distinction is a little bit of a harebrained distinction, but the idea here is that when we're talking about when Goodpaster is laying out his view, he's wanting to talk about the normative facts involved. So it's not so much the idea of it's intelligible to subscribe considerability to a thing without its actually being considerable. Uh, but the idea is that there might be some morally considerable things that don't really seem to be considerable to us, intuitively speaking, like plants, right? So his condition on being morally considerable is being alive. That may have some counterintuitive implications, and that's okay. He's saying that I'm not trying to make a super intuitive account here. I'm trying instead to offer um, just like identifying a fact about the world, and then like doing that, and then like showing that some plants fall into that too. Okay, and lastly, he talks about framework questions as opposed to questions of application. And the idea here is that he's talking about the kind of the theory of his view, right? And he's not talking about actually applying his view in real life, right? So it's we're not going to be able to not kill any plants, right? Um, he's just saying that he's just saying that look, this is like a plausible candidate view for who has moral considerability, right? And in real world practices, we probably can't not say kill plants. We probably can't not say kill bacteria and things like this. Um, and he's not making a claim that we ought to stop doing various practices. Um, Rather, we probably have good reasons for those practices, which override the moral considerability of many plants and bacteria and such. Okay, so he says he's trying to formulate a relatively substantive, as opposed to merely logically consistent, criterion for moral considerability, as opposed to moral significance, of a regulative as opposed to operative sort. Um, so the idea here, and this is the big takeaway here, is that a thing's being alive is both necessary and sufficient for moral considerability in this sense, right? So he's saying that, look, if you're alive, then you matter morally. You have baseline moral considerability. So he just kind of lays this out as a candidate view for moral considerability, and he's going to argue against other accounts of moral considerability, right? So he's going to argue against Kant and like rational agency as a necessary condition um, on moral considerability. He's going to be talking about Warnock's, and also for our purposes Singer's sentience principle, and then he's going to be talking about Feinberg's interest criterion. So first, Kant wants to say that X is morally considerable if and only if, meaning necessary and sufficient condition, X is a rational human person. But this poses a problem because it omits children and the mentally handicapped. So we can propose a variant of the Kant principle, and it's something like X is morally considerable if and only if X is a rational human person, or as a potentially rational human person. So this may have another problem, right? It includes children. So a child is a potentially rational human person, right? They're going to develop such that they turn into a rational human being. Um, but not all, there are some non rational human adults who who lack the potential for rational agency at some point in the future. So so it's the case that it would be the case that human persons that lack mental capacities, according to this principle, they don't matter morally speaking, right? They're more like rocks. And so Goodpaster is saying that, look, that's like a problem, right? So it seems like when we start to think about broadening our scope, the capacity for rational agency is going to leave out too many people that we feel like should enter into our moral scope. That's the idea here. Okay, so the sentience principle is something like X is morally considerable if and only if X is capable of suffering pain or experiencing enjoyment. So the idea here is that, and we will be talking about Singer soon enough. He says that, look, uh, uh, things matter morally speaking if and only if they can experience pain and pleasure, right? And so Singer is a utilitarian, a consequentialist. So he's thinking about good outcomes, and he's thinking about maximizing the good. And so when we make animals suffer, we are not maximizing the good. That's kind of the big stick um, from Singer. So um, so Goodpaster raises a problem with this, and he says that it's reasonable to hold that sentience is sufficient for considerability, but we don't really have any good reason to think that it's necessary. Um, And so the idea here is that there's not any really good arguments that suggest that sentience is a necessary condition for being morally considerable. So why think that non-sentient things can't also be morally considerable? And the idea with this quote, and he's giving some reasons here. He says that um, sentience is a evolutionarily speaking, sentience is a came into existence in order to help creatures and beings preserve life, right? So if sentience exists in order to preserve life, it seems like life is both prior to and more important than sentience, according to Goodpaster. So the idea is that, look, life is the central thing that sentience is intended to protect. And so, as a consequence, we need to, morally speaking, we need to take into account life rather than sentience. Okay, and then lastly, he talks about the interests criterion. So X is morally considerable only if, so this is just a necessary condition, X has interests. And so the idea here is we can distinguish between consciously held interests and just interests, right? Non consciously held interests. Feinberg seems to assume that interests already sort of presuppose wants and desires and aims and such. Whereas Goodpaster is going to suggest that this is not right. He wants to say that um, that a thing can have interests even if it doesn't have the ability to consciously hold those interests in mind. So the idea here is that a thing need not be able to reflect on its own interest or hold an interest or be able to act on an interest in order to have an interest, um, in part because things can go better or worse for it, right? Okay. So, lastly, and I'll just like kind of go through these pretty quickly. Um, uh, Goodpaster raises 6 objections to his criterion. So recall that his criterion is a thing's being alive is both necessary and sufficient for moral considerability. Um, so one is just look, this is just romanticism insofar as it makes everything sentient. Um, he says that this is a stupid objection. He says that this is just false. Um, uh, his point is that sentience is not a necessary condition for moral considerability, right? Um, I don't know. This objection kind of reminds me of Euthyphro's first answer to what is piety. It's just like, well, what's what I'm doing right now? It's just kind of stupid. So, objection two is that this denigrates the central role of conscious beings. Um, he replies in saying that uh, he turns back to the distinction he makes between significance and considerability, right? So he's not saying that plants and like conscious beings and humans and animals have to be equal necessarily, right? He's just saying that plants and bacteria and everything that's alive has the minimum baseline of moral considerability. So I mentioned earlier about philosophers wanting to define things very precisely. The idea here is that life can't be defined very precisely, like at all, and so that means that it's an implausible criterion for moral considerability. To which Goodpaster responds that life can be precisely defined, at least as any other potential criterion. Okay, objection four. Um, so this is funny. So it might be that, like, say, an ecosystem is alive according to our definition of life. If our definition of life includes an ecosystem or a biosphere or a biosystem, then it would have to be morally considerable too. And Goodpaster is like cool with that. He's like, well, okay, whatever. Then it is, and then it does matter morally. Um, five is we can't know what the interests of non-sentient beings are. This is clearly just false. These are just facts about what is good and what is bad for different things, right? So if I have a plant, right, and I don't water it, that's bad for the plant. It's going to die. Whereas if I do water it, that's good for the plant. It's going to continue living, right? So it seems like we could just study biology and figure out what a plant or an animal or whatever the living being is. We can figure out what their interests are because we can study what's good and what's bad for them. And then lastly, one cannot live according to a principle for respect for all life. Um, and so he replies, he goes back to his distinctions at the beginning, that this is not a question of application, right? Um, in this sense, an ought does not imply a can. So Kant famously says that ought implies can. He's sidestepping that question. He's just saying what does matter, um, and he's saying that that plants do have the minimal basis for moral considerability, but it doesn't necessarily follow from that that we owe them certain things, right? Okay, well, this is the end of the lecture here. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I think that this is like one of the most interesting papers that we read for this class. And soon enough, we'll be talking about Leopold and Sandler, as well as Singer. So we'll do some animal ethics as well as some environmental ethics and stuff. Okay.